The bolt slid home with the sound of a bone breaking. It was a final, metallic crack that severed Eleanor Grace Whitley from the life she had known, a life that had lasted only 6 weeks. She stood on the edge of the porch, the rough-hewn planks icy beneath her bare feet, and watched as the last sliver of lamplight from inside was snuffed out by the heavy oak door. Her husband, Silas, was on the other side. His final words still hung in the biting air, colder than the wind that was beginning to whip down from the mountains. "Baron," he had spat, his face contorted in a mask of righteous fury. "You are a barren wife, ashamed of my name. You have failed in your duty to God and to me." Her hand, trembling and already numb, clutched a fistful of white fabric at her waist. It was the bodice of her wedding dress, the one her mother had stitched with such hopeful prayers. Now, a long, ragged tear ran from the collar to her hip, a testament to the struggle that had preceded her exile. A dark, ugly bruise was blooming on her cheekbone, a cruel violet against her pale skin. She had nothing. Silas had taken her small dowry as his right, and now he had taken her dignity, her shelter, her name. She was no longer Mrs. Whitley. She was nothing. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to mimic the one trapped in her own throat. It tore at the thin cotton of her dress, a garment made for a warm chapel in late autumn, not for the sudden, vicious onset of a winter that promised to be unforgiving. Snow was in the air. She could smell its clean, sharp scent, a promise of purification and death. For a moment, she thought of beating on the door, of screaming his name, of begging for the mercy he had sworn to show her before God and her father. But the look in his eyes had extinguished that hope. It was the look of a man discarding a broken tool. There was no love there, no pity, only disgust. She turned away from the door, from the sturdy ranch house that was meant to be her home, and faced the vast, swallowing darkness of the plains. A single light glimmered in the far distance, a tiny, defiant pinprick against the endless black. It seemed miles away, an impossible destination, but it was the only thing to walk toward, putting one foot in front of the other. Eleanor descended the porch steps. The frozen ground was a bed of knives against the soles of her feet. Each step was a fresh agony, a sharp, searing pain that shot up her legs. She had been the preacher's daughter, a woman of quiet refinement, taught to walk with her head held high and her hands folded demurely. Now, she stumbled like a drunkard, her body already racked with a deep, consuming chill that had begun to feel like fire. The landscape was a skeleton of what it had been in the summer. The creek bed she crossed was a ghostly ribbon of pale, dry stones, its cheerful babble replaced by the rattling whisper of the wind. Tumbleweeds, like the gnarled bones of forgotten creatures, cartwheeled past her in the gloom, their thorny branches snagging at her torn dress. The world was empty, stripped of life and color, a perfect mirror for the desolation in her soul. A fever was taking hold. The world began to tilt and sway, the distant light blurring and splitting into 2, then 3. Her thoughts became a tangled thicket of memory and sensation. She remembered her father's stern face as he handed her over to Silas, the pride in his eyes that his daughter was marrying a man of property. He would not take her back. A daughter returned in shame was worse than no daughter at all. She remembered the brief, hopeful joy of her wedding day, the scratch of Silas's wool coat against her cheek, the taste of whiskey on his kiss, and she remembered the sharp, cramping pain weeks later. The blood that had signaled not just the loss of a child she had barely known was there, but the loss of her worth, her purpose, her safety. Silas had called it a punishment from God. He had accused her of being impure, of carrying a secret sin that had blighted his land and his lineage. The accusations had grown more frequent, his temper shorter, his hands heavier. Tonight, it had ended. Her bare feet were numb now, clumsy blocks of ice she could barely command. She tripped over a stone, her hands flying out to break her fall, scraping against the hard, unforgiving earth. She did not have the strength to cry. The tears would only freeze on her face. All she could do was push herself up, her body a single, screaming nerve of pain and cold. and continue her blind pilgrimage toward that faint, distant light. She did not know how long she walked. Time had dissolved into a cycle of stumbling, falling, and rising again. The fever was a mercy now, wrapping her mind in a thick, confusing fog that dulled the edges of her despair. She was no longer Eleanor Grace Whitley. She was a creature of instinct, driven only by the primal need to move toward warmth, toward light. The fence line appeared out of the darkness like a row of skeletal sentinels, a rough-hewn post and wire fence, marking a property line in the middle of nowhere. It seemed an insurmountable obstacle. She reached for the top wire, her fingers too stiff to properly grip it. Her legs gave out from under her, and she slumped to the ground, her torn dress pooling around her like a shroud. The light was gone. The darkness had finally won. Her last conscious thought was a quiet, detached surprise that death was so very, very cold. Caleb Rowe moved through the pre-dawn gloom with the practiced silence of a predator. The air was sharp in his lungs, each breath a plume of white vapor that vanished into the graying darkness. The wind had a new edge to it, the kind that promised a heavy, deep snow that would last for days, maybe weeks. It was good trapping weather. It was bad weather for everything else. He was checking his southern line, his boots crunching softly on the frozen buffalo grass. His gaze, accustomed to scanning the horizon for the slightest movement, caught on a pale shape crumpled against his fence post. At first, he thought it was a deer, caught and panicked in the wire. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something far more troubling. It was a woman. She was dressed in a tattered white dress, a foolish, flimsy thing, utterly unsuited for the country, let alone for a night like this. Her feet were bare, blue and raw. One side of her face was swollen and bruised. She was terrifyingly still, a dusting of frost already gathering on her dark hair. Caleb knelt beside her, his movements economical and precise. He pulled off a thick leather glove and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. For a long, tense moment, there was nothing. Then he felt it, a faint, thready pulse, as weak and fragile as a trapped bird's heartbeat. He swore under his breath, a low, guttural sound. He did not want this. He had built his life out here, far from the town of Harper's Hollow, precisely to avoid this kind of complication. People brought judgment, trouble, and noise. He had had enough of all 3 to last a lifetime, but he was not a man who could leave a living thing to die in the cold. It was not in his nature, no matter how much he wished it were. Without another moment of hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold bones and thin cloth. He adjusted her weight, her head lolling against his shoulder, and began the steady, ground-eating stride back toward his cabin. She was burning with fever, her skin radiating a dry, desperate heat that was a stark contrast to the icy cold of her limbs. His cabin was less a home and more a fortress against the wilderness, built of thick, saddle-notched logs chinked with mud and moss. It was low-roofed and solid, designed to withstand the crushing weight of snow and the force of the prairie winds. He pushed the heavy plank door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow of dying embers in the stone hearth. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, cured leather, and the faint, musky scent of the wolf pelts that were thrown over the single cot and used as rugs on the floor. It was a space built for solitude and survival, not for comfort. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools were the only furniture besides the cot. A rack on the wall held a well-oiled rifle and a shotgun. Caleb carried the woman directly to the hearth and gently laid her down on the thickest of the wolf pelts. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. For a long moment, he simply stood over her, his face a mask of grim contemplation. She was a ruin of a woman, broken, bruised, and cast out. He knew the look. He had seen it in the eyes of wounded animals, and sometimes in his own reflection. He moved to the hearth, adding logs to the embers until a proper fire was crackling, its warmth beginning to push back against the cabin's chill. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. He turned back to the woman and began the delicate task of tending to her. He was as gentle as his calloused, scarred hands would allow, removing the torn, dirt-caked dress and wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. He did not linger on her nakedness or her injuries. He worked with a detached efficiency, his focus solely on the task of keeping the faint spark of life within her from being extinguished. Eleanor woke to the sensation of warmth. It was a slow, creeping realization, a gentle tide pushing back the deep, consuming cold that had filled her dreams. Her eyelids felt as heavy as stones, but she forced them open. The world was a blur of dancing orange light and deep shadows. She was lying on something soft and unfamiliar, the scent of wood smoke and something wild filling her senses. A fire crackled nearby, its heat a blissful comfort on her skin. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and a raw, hacking cough seized her body, leaving her breathless and weak. A shadow moved beside her. A man. He was large, broad-shouldered, and his face was lost in the gloom. He knelt and reached for her, and a jolt of pure terror shot through her. She flinched violently. Scrambling backward on the pelt, the wool blanket clutched to her chest. Her mind screamed with the memory of Silas's hands, of his face twisted in rage. "No," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Please." The man stopped instantly. He did not speak. He simply held his position, his hand frozen in midair. He had been reaching for the blanket, which had slipped from her shoulder. In his hand was a wooden cup, steam rising from it in a fragrant cloud. Slowly, as if not to spook a feral animal, he placed the cup on the floor beside her, well within her reach but far enough away that he would not have to touch her. Then he retreated, moving back into the shadows until he was just a silhouette against the far wall of the cabin. Eleanor watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was not like Silas. There was a stillness about him, a quiet patience that was completely alien to her. After a long moment, her trembling began to subside. She looked at the cup, then back at the silent figure in the shadows. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered into the space between them. It was not a plea, but a simple statement of fact, the last, tattered truth of her existence. Caleb did not respond. He had heard her. The words hung in the small cabin, more substantial than the smoke curling toward the ceiling. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she recoiled from him as if from a hot iron. He understood it. The world had taught her that a man's touch was a prelude to pain. He would not force his presence on her. He had offered shelter. The rest was up to her. He remained by the far wall, a silent guardian, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. He knew the wind was rising, that the snow had begun to fall in thick, heavy flakes. He knew they would be trapped here together for days. He said nothing of this. He said nothing of the bruises that marred her face or the desperate, broken look in her eyes. He simply gave her the one thing no one else had, space, and he let her stay. In the quiet moments, when the woman slept her fevered, fitful sleep, Caleb's own past would rise unbidden. It was not a single, coherent memory, but a storm of fragments. The stifling heat of the courtroom in Harper's Hollow, the hostile glares of the townsfolk, their faces pinched with suspicion and hate, the sharp, accusing voice of the prosecutor, the sickening thud of the judge's gavel. He remembered the word acquitted, how it had rung hollow in the silence of the room. He had been cleared by the law, but not by the people. He had killed a white rancher, a man named Jedediah Stone. The fact that he had done it to stop Stone from beating his friend, a mixed-blood tracker named Joseph Littlewolf, to death, was a detail the town chose to forget. All they saw was one of their own, dead at the hands of a man who preferred the company of what they called a half-breed. He remembered Joseph's face after the trial, the gratitude mixed with a deep, abiding sorrow. "You are a free man, Caleb," Joseph had said, "but you will never be free of this." He had been right. The whispers followed him. The women who pulled their children closer when he passed. The men who would stop talking when he entered the saloon. The word they used for him. A bitter slur that clung to him like mud. Redmond's dog. So he had left. Not the territory, but the town. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, deep in the hills where the only judgment came from the changing of the seasons. He had found a semblance of peace in the solitude, a quiet order in the rhythms of hunting and trapping. And now, this woman, this piece of the broken world he had tried to escape, was lying by his fire. Over the next few days, a fragile routine formed within the confines of the snowbound cabin. Eleanor's fever broke, leaving her weak and drained, but lucid. The preacher's daughter in her, the part that could not abide idleness, tried to make herself useful. She attempted to sweep the rough plank floor with a worn broom, but her body was too frail. A fit of dizziness sent her staggering back to the hearth. She tried to help mend one of his shirts, but her fingers were too clumsy and stiff to properly handle the needle. Each time she failed. A fresh wave of shame washed over her. She felt like a useless burden, another mouth to feed in a world where every scrap of food was hard-won. Caleb seemed not to notice her failed attempts. He moved around her with a quiet, unobtrusive grace, never speaking unless necessary. He would leave a bowl of thin broth or a piece of hardtack on the stool beside her, then retreat to the other side of the cabin to mend a trap or sharpen a knife. He never met her eyes. It was not a gesture of unkindness, she realized, but of respect. He was allowing her to heal in her own time, without the pressure of expectation or the humiliation of pity. He treated her not as a woman, but as a wounded creature he had taken under his roof, one that needed time and quiet to find its strength again. On the 4th day, the silence was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle. The sound was close, shockingly loud. Eleanor flinched, her body tensing as she scrambled up, her eyes wide with fear. The sound of a gunshot meant only one thing to her: violence, anger, death. She crept to the cabin's single, small window, a piece of greased parchment that let in a milky, gray light. Peering through a small tear in the corner, she saw him. Caleb was standing in the snow-filled clearing in front of the cabin, his back to her. The rifle was shouldered, its stock held firm against his body. He was not hunting. He was practicing. He fired again and again. His movements were fluid, economical, deadly. He would raise the rifle, sight, fire, and reload in a single, seamless motion. There was a wildness in his stance, an intensity in the set of his shoulders that she had not seen before. This was not the quiet, gentle man who left food by her side. This was a man who knew violence intimately, who had made it a part of himself in order to survive. She saw him then not just as a cowboy or a recluse, but as a man who had fought something brutal and had come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. In that moment, she felt a flicker not of fear, but of a strange, profound sense of safety. Later that evening, as the fire cast long, dancing shadows on the log walls, she found her voice. He was sitting on a stool, cleaning the rifle, his hands moving with practiced familiarity over the polished wood and blued steel. "Thank you," she said softly. He did not look up, but his hands stilled for a fraction of a second. "You saved my life," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "I would have died out there." He finished wiping down the barrel before he finally raised his head. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers for the first time. They were filled with a deep, ancient weariness. But there was something else there, too, an understanding. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her pale face, the fading bruise on her cheek, the way she still clutched the wool blanket around her like armor. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "You looked like someone who had not been held in a while," he said, his voice a low rumble, and in the profound, aching truth of those simple words, Eleanor Grace Whitley felt the first, fragile seed of something she had thought was lost to her forever: hope. The snow fell without pause, a silent, relentless siege against the small cabin. It piled in soft, heavy drifts against the log walls and climbed steadily up the greased parchment window, turning the gray daylight into a dim, underwater gloom. The world outside had vanished, erased by a curtain of white. Inside, the cabin became a self-contained universe, smelling of pine smoke, drying herbs, and the faint, ever-present scent of the wolf pelts. For Eleanor, it was a sanctuary and a prison, a place of quiet healing where the silence was so profound it often felt louder than any noise. Her strength returned in small, grudging increments. She began to take on the chores of the cabin, moving with a quiet determination that was a form of prayer. She learned to bank the fire at night and stir the embers back to life in the morning. She kneaded the dense, heavy dough for their daily bread, her arms aching with the effort. She scrubbed the 2 wooden bowls and the single iron pot until they shone. Each completed task was a small victory, a piece of her shattered self-worth she was painstakingly gluing back into place. But her body held the memory of its trauma, a persistent limp in her right leg. A souvenir from Silas's final, violent shove made her movements uneven, and a deep rattling cough would seize her unexpectedly, especially in the cold mornings. A raw, ugly sound that she tried to stifle in the folds of her blanket. She was ashamed of these weaknesses, seeing them as visible proof of her failure, her fragility. She tried to hide them from Caleb, moving more carefully when she felt his eyes on her, turning away to bury the worst of her coughing fits in her shoulder. Caleb, for his part, never mentioned them. He seemed to possess an animal's sensitivity, an awareness of her pain that required no words. He simply adjusted. If he saw her struggling to lift the heavy water bucket, he would appear at her side and take it from her without a word. He began leaving a tin cup of a hot, bitter herbal tea by the hearth for her in the mornings, a brew that soothed the raw scrape in her lungs. He moved through their shared space with a quiet consideration that was more comforting than any spoken sympathy could ever be. Several days into the storm, as they sat on opposite sides of the hearth in the deepening twilight, the silence stretched thin, worn by the unspoken questions that hung between them. Eleanor was stitching a patch onto the knee of Caleb's worn denim trousers, her movements slow but steady. Caleb was oiling a piece of leather, his large hands working the grease into the hide with a focused intensity. Finally, he spoke. His voice, low and rough, startled her. "Why were you out there?" The question was simple, direct, stripped of any artifice. It was the question she had been dreading and, in a strange way, waiting for. She set the trousers aside, her fingers suddenly cold and clumsy. She stared into the fire, watching the flames lick and curl around a log, consuming it slowly, turning it to ash. She began to speak, her voice barely a whisper, the words tasting like poison and shame on her tongue. "My husband, he put me out." Caleb's hand stilled on the leather, but he did not look at her. He granted her the privacy of the fire's gaze. "We were married 6 weeks ago," she continued, the story tumbling out in broken fragments. "My father is the preacher in Harper's Hollow. Silas Whitley is a rancher. It was considered a good match. He wanted a wife to present a respectable home, a pious woman to stand beside him." She took a shuddering breath. "He did not marry me for love. He married me for appearances." The cabin was utterly silent save for the crackle of the fire and the muffled moan of the wind outside. I found I was with child. For a few weeks. He was pleased. It was what he wanted. An heir to his name, his property." Her voice broke, and she had to stop, pressing her knuckles to her lips. "Then I lost the child. There was blood, so much blood. The doctor said it happens sometimes, that it was not my fault." She looked up from the fire, though not at Caleb. Her eyes were fixed on the dark, chinked logs of the far wall. "Silas did not believe him. He said I was being punished, that I was unclean, barren. He said I had brought a curse upon his house. He grew angry. His temper was a terrible thing. He began to drink more. And his hands." She trailed off, one hand instinctively going to the faded bruise on her cheek. "That night," she whispered, "he told me I had failed, that I was a disgrace to his name. He tore my dress, and then he opened the door and told me to get out. He locked it behind me." The story was finished. The ugly, wretched truth of it lay bare between them in the small, warm cabin. Eleanor felt hollowed out, as if the telling had scooped out the last of her insides. She braced herself for the questions, for the judgment, for the inevitable pity that would make her feel even smaller. Caleb said nothing for a long time. The only sound was the rhythmic squeak of the leather as his hands began to move again, working the oil with a slow, controlled pressure. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly murmur, devoid of pity but filled with a profound, chilling bitterness. "Ain't just you," he said, his eyes still fixed on his work. "They break what they don't understand." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was not pitying her. He was validating her. He was placing her suffering within a larger, crueler pattern of the world. In that moment, she felt a bond with this silent, solitary man. A sense of being seen that was so powerful it almost made her weep. "He is a prominent man in Harper's Hollow," she said, her voice trembling. The name of the town felt like a stone in her mouth. A sudden, cold dread washed over her. When the snows cleared, where would she go? Back there? The thought was unbearable. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of panic. "Please," she begged, "do not take me back there. I cannot go back. I would rather die out here than go back to that town." Caleb finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't go to town," he said simply. The statement hung in the air. It was not just a reassurance. It was a confession. "Why?" she asked, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. He looked away, back toward the shadows. "Folks there have a name for me." He paused, and she could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Redmond's dog," he said, the slur falling from his lips with a weight of old, worn-out pain. "I defended a friend in court, years ago, a man of mixed blood. They never forgave me for it." Redmond's dog. The name was ugly, vicious. It conjured images of a man who was less than human, a stray who had chosen the wrong pack. She understood then that his solitude was not entirely by choice. Like her, he was an outcast. He had been judged and found wanting by the very people she was so desperate to escape. The days that followed were different. A subtle shift had occurred in the cabin's atmosphere. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the things they now knew about each other. It was a silence of shared exile. The cabin felt quieter, but also warmer, safer. Eleanor found herself watching Caleb more closely. She watched his hands. They were remarkable hands, scarred and hardened from years of work and weather. The knuckles were thick, the fingers calloused, but there was a surprising gentleness in their movements. She watched him painstakingly repair a section of the cabin wall where the winter wind had forced a draft. His movements precise and economical. He worked with a deep, abiding competence, a man completely at home in the harsh realities of his world. One afternoon, she watched him preparing to shave. He stropped a straight razor on a leather strap with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. He lathered a coarse bar of soap in a wooden bowl, his reflection staring back at him from a small, cracked piece of mirror he had propped against the wall. An impulse, bold and utterly foreign to the timid woman she had been, rose within her. It was a need to offer a kindness, to perform an act of care that was not a chore, but a gesture. "Let me help you," she said, her voice soft but clear. Caleb froze, the shaving brush held halfway to his face. He looked at her reflection in the mirror, his eyes questioning. "It is a gesture of thanks," she explained, her cheeks flushing. "For what you have done for me." He hesitated for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. He sat on one of the stools, his back straight, his face turned toward the firelight. Eleanor's heart beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She took the bowl and brush from him, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact was like a spark of electricity. She carefully lathered his face, her touch feather-light on the rough stubble of his jaw and neck. She was intensely aware of his stillness, of the warmth of his skin, of the sheer, masculine presence of him. It had been a long time since she had been this close to a man without fear. She picked up the razor. The cold steel felt heavy and dangerous in her hand. She held her breath and drew the blade down his cheek in a single, smooth stroke. He did not flinch. He sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, a statue of trust. The intimacy of the act was staggering. Her hand on his jaw, the razor against his throat, their shared breath misting in the cool air of the cabin. It was more intimate than any of the fumbling, duty-bound encounters she had endured with her husband. When she was finished, she wiped the last of the soap from his face with a warm, damp cloth. His skin was smooth beneath her fingers. For a fleeting second, her hand lingered on his cheek. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the space between them shimmered with a new and unspoken awareness. She pulled her hand back as if burned, and he cleared his throat, turning away to put the mirror and razor away. Neither of them spoke of it, but the quiet act had changed the very air they breathed. At night, the cabin grew colder, and the ghosts came out. Eleanor would lie on her bed of pelts, wrapped in her blanket, and listen to the wind howling around the eaves. On the other side of the small room, Caleb lay on his cot. Most nights, he was as still as stone, but some nights, she would hear him. It would start with a restless shifting, the creak of the cot's rope supports, then the soft thud of his bare feet on the plank floor. She would lie with her eyes closed, feigning sleep, and listen to him pace, back and forth, a caged animal trapped not by the snow, but by something inside his own mind. The sound was one of a deep and terrible sorrow. One night, the pacing stopped. It was replaced by a different sound, one so quiet she at first thought she was imagining it. A choked, ragged sound. She opened her eyes. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, casting a soft, weak light through the cabin. Caleb was kneeling in front of a large wooden chest in the corner, his back to her. His broad shoulders were shaking. He was weeping. He held something in his hands, a small, pale piece of cloth that he clutched as if it were the most precious thing in the world. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw what it was. An old child's shirt, small and faded, quietly, so as not to startle him. She rose from her bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She approached him slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. She did not speak. She simply stood a few feet behind him, a silent witness to his private grief. He must have sensed her presence. His shoulders stilled, and he took a long, shuddering breath. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I had a wife once," he said to the darkness. "Her name was Nalin. It means morning star in her language. She was Crow." He finally turned, his face shadowed and streaked with tears. He looked utterly broken. "She died here, in this cabin, giving birth to our son." He looked down at the tiny shirt in his hands. "He died with her. I held him for less than an hour." The raw, unvarnished pain in his voice pierced Eleanor's heart. "There is no grave marker," he continued, his voice hollow. "The preacher in Harper's Hollow would not allow a Crow woman to be buried in the churchyard, and the ground was too frozen to dig. I buried them on the hill, under the big pine tree. There was no justice, no service, just me and the wind." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers in the dim light, as if seeking an answer to a question he did not know how to ask. And in that moment, Eleanor's own dam of grief, the one she had so carefully constructed, finally broke. A great silent sob tore through her. Tears streamed down her face for her own lost child, for her lost home, for the brutal, casual cruelty of the world. "My father," she wept, the words coming out in a torrent. "He turned his back on me. When I married Silas, he said I was marrying beneath our class, that a rancher was not good enough for a preacher's daughter. He was pleased with the property, but not the man. When Silas cast me out, I thought of going to him. But I knew the door would be closed. The shame would be too much for him to bear. They were two broken halves of the same whole, two souls cast out and left to weather the storm alone. He had lost a wife and child to prejudice and the harshness of the land. She had lost a child and a home to the cold, unforgiving judgment of men. He did not move to comfort her. She did not move to comfort him. They simply sat in the deep, profound darkness of the cabin, the glowing embers of the fire casting a faint, warm light upon them. Two broken hearts, not touching, but in their shared sorrow, they were, for the first time in a very long time, no longer alone. The thaw did not come gently. It arrived with the sound of a world cracking apart. During the day, water dripped incessantly from the cabin's eaves, a rhythmic, drumming heartbeat that signaled the end of the long silence. At night, the meltwater would freeze again, and the mornings were filled with the sharp groans of ice shifting and breaking. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, loamy scent of damp earth reawakening. Life, stubborn and persistent, was returning to the hills. Eleanor felt the change in her own body. The deep, rattling cough had softened, and the ache in her bones had receded with the frost. A fragile strength was seeping back into her limbs, and with it, a restlessness she had not felt since before her marriage. The cabin, once a life-saving sanctuary, now felt small, confining. Caleb must have sensed it too. One bright, clear morning, when the sun was a welcome warmth on the face, he stood by the open cabin door and simply said, "The creek is running high. You should see it." Before she could answer, he was outside, leading his horse from the lean-to that served as a stable. It was a sturdy buckskin gelding, a creature as solid and quiet as its owner. Caleb moved with an easy familiarity, saddling the horse and checking the cinches. He worked without looking at her, but the invitation was clear. A thrill, half excitement and half fear, coursed through her. She had ridden as a girl, on gentle mares from the town livery, but it had been years. And she had no proper clothes, only the simple wool dress she had made from one of Caleb's old blankets and a pair of his worn boots, stuffed with rags to fit her smaller feet. She stepped out into the brilliant sunshine, blinking against the glare of the remaining snow patches. Caleb finished with the saddle and turned to her. He simply held out a gloved hand. She took it, and he effortlessly swung her up into the saddle. He then unlooped the reins from the post and handed them to her. "His name is Buck," he said. "He'll follow my lead." He was not going to ride with her. He was trusting her with his horse, his most valuable possession, his means of survival. The gesture was so profound, so full of unspoken faith, that it left her breathless. He began to walk, and with a gentle nudge from her heels, Buck fell into step behind him. They climbed into the hills, following a barely there trail that Caleb seemed to know by heart. The air was alive with the chatter of birds and the rush of melting snow finding its way to lower ground. Caleb pointed out the fresh tracks of a deer, the first buds on a hardy scrub oak, the high soaring circle of a hawk against the brilliant blue sky. He spoke more on that walk than he had in all the weeks she had known him. His words simple, direct observations about the world he knew so intimately. And Eleanor listened, her heart feeling as if it were thawing along with the landscape. The wind teased stray strands of hair from her braid, and the sun warmed her skin. She felt the powerful, living muscle of the horse beneath her, a steady and reassuring presence. For the first time since she could remember, she was not a daughter, not a wife, not a victim. She was just a woman on a horse, moving through a world that felt new and full of promise. When they reached the ridge overlooking the creek, she gasped. The water, which she remembered as a gentle, meandering stream, was now a churning, muddy torrent. It roared through the valley, carrying with it the debris of winter, branches, rocks, and entire chunks of the icy bank. It was a display of raw, untamable power, a force of cleansing and destruction all at once. Caleb stood beside the horse, his gaze on the water. "It washes everything clean," he said, his voice low. For a little while. Anyway, Eleanor looked down at him, at his strong, weathered profile against the sky, and a smile bloomed on her face. It was not the demure, practiced smile of the preacher's daughter. It was a wide, uninhibited expression of pure, unadulterated joy. For the first time since the snows had trapped her, she truly beamed with life. The journey back was quieter, filled with a comfortable, shared peace. But as they descended through a thick stand of old-growth pines, the peace was shattered. Two men on horseback emerged from the trees ahead, blocking the narrow trail. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They were hard-faced men with a predatory stillness about them. Both wore guns strapped low on their hips, and their eyes, cold and assessing, missed nothing. They were bounty hunters. Eleanor knew the type from the hushed, fearful stories told in town. Caleb drew Buck to a halt, his body becoming instantly, dangerously still. His hand rested casually on his thigh, inches from the worn butt of the pistol he always carried. The taller of the two men, a man with a scarred lip and pale, colorless eyes, let his gaze drift from Caleb to Eleanor. His eyes narrowed for a moment in simple appraisal, then widened with a flash of recognition. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," the man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He nudged his partner, a shorter, heavier man who was watching Caleb with wary concentration. "Look here, Boone. Ain't that the preacher's daughter from Harper's Hollow? The one that got herself thrown out by Whitley?" The name, Whitley, struck Eleanor like a physical blow. The sun seemed to grow cold, the air thin. The man's gaze was insolent, raking over her makeshift dress and worn boots with open contempt. He was not just seeing her. He was seeing her shame, her story, and calculating its worth. Caleb urged Buck forward, his voice level and cold as a river stone. "You're blocking the trail." The scarred man, Cutler, held Caleb's gaze for a long, tense moment. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Finally, with another smirk at Eleanor, he backed his horse aside. "Just making our way to town," he said. "Lots of news to share." They rode past, and Eleanor could feel their eyes on her back until the trees swallowed them from view. She was trembling, the rain slick in her suddenly sweating palms. The joy of the day had curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear in her stomach. That night, the fear consumed her. She could not eat, could not sit still. She paced the small cabin, her footsteps echoing Caleb's own restless sound from nights past. The walls, which had been a comfort, now felt like a trap. "They'll go to the town," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "They'll tell everyone they saw me. Silas, my father, they'll come for me. They will drag me back." The image filled her mind, being paraded through the main street of Harper's Hollow. A spectacle of disgrace, the pointing fingers, the righteous whispers, the smug, satisfied look on her husband's face. The thought was a torment worse than any physical pain. Caleb watched her, his face grim in the firelight. He let her pace, let the fear pour out of her until she finally sagged against the wall, her face buried in her hands. He rose from his stool and came to stand before her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable presence in the flickering light. "Let them come," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They'll have to go through me first." It was not a boast. It was a promise, as solid and unyielding as the mountains outside. Eleanor looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his steady, resolute gaze. In that moment, she believed him. The fear did not vanish, but it loosened its suffocating grip, pushed back by the sheer, unshakable force of his will. The next day, he took her outside into the clearing. He carried his rifle and his pistol. "You need to learn," he said. It was not a suggestion. He started her with the rifle. It was heavy, the wood worn smooth from his hands, the metal cold against her shoulder. He showed her how to stand, how to brace herself, how to sight down the long barrel at a tin can he had set on a distant stump. His instructions were patient, practical, his voice a calm murmur in her ear. He stood behind her, his hands correcting her stance, his arm brushing hers as he showed her how to work the lever action. The proximity was both unnerving and deeply comforting. She was acutely aware of his warmth, of the scent of leather and pine that clung to him. It was a quiet, intimate dance of instruction. His movements were sure, hers were hesitant, clumsy. When she finally pulled the trigger, the explosion was deafening. The rifle kicked back with a brutal force that slammed into her shoulder. Staggering her, she cried out, dropping the weapon in the snow. Her shot had gone wide, kicking up a spray of dirt far to the left of the can. Her shoulder throbbed, and her ears rang. Tears of frustration and pain welled in her eyes. This was impossible. She hated the noise, the violence of it. Caleb picked up the rifle without a word. Again, he said, his voice gentle but firm. And so she did. Day after day. They practiced. Her hands grew calloused, her shoulder bruised, but her resolve hardened. She was shaky, but she was determined. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it, to absorb the recoil without flinching. Slowly, her shots grew steadier. One afternoon, with a satisfying ping, the tin can flew off the stump. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. It was more than learning to shoot. It was an act of transformation. With every successful shot, she was chipping away at the helpless, terrified woman who had collapsed in the snow. She was forging a new self, a woman who could stand her ground, a woman who could fight back. One night, after a long day of practice, they sat by the fire. The comfortable silence restored between them. Caleb took out a flask of whiskey and poured a small amount into 2 tin cups. He handed one to her. She had never tasted spirits before. A preacher's daughter did not partake, but she was no longer just the preacher's daughter. She took the cup. The whiskey was fire in her throat, a spreading warmth that settled deep in her belly, loosening the tight knots of fear and propriety. It made her bold. They drank in silence for a while. The only sounds, the crackling fire and the distant call of an owl. She looked at his hand, resting on his knee. It was the hand that had taught her to hold a rifle, the hand that had carried her from the snow, the hand that had wept while clutching a child's shirt. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her own hand over his. The gesture was electric. Caleb froze, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. Her touch was not a plea for help, not the grasp of a drowning woman. It was a quiet question, an offering. She was asking for permission, not for salvation. He slowly turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His calloused skin was rough against her own. He looked at her, and his eyes, so often guarded and unreadable, were filled with a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a gentle, questioning touch. It tasted of whiskey and wood smoke. Then it deepened, and all the unspoken words, all the shared grief and fragile hope of the past weeks poured into it. It was a kiss of desperate, profound connection, a recognition of 2 solitary souls finding an anchor in each other. But just as the kiss intensified, he pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. She opened her eyes, confused, a flicker of her old fear, of rejection, stabbing at her. "You're still healing," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion and restraint. It ain't something to be rushed." He was not pushing her away. He was protecting her. He was giving her a respect that Silas had never even considered. He was honoring the wounds she still carried, even if it meant denying his own needs, his own desires. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. But they were not tears of rejection. They were tears of a deep, overwhelming respect for this man's quiet, powerful decency. She squeezed his hand and simply nodded, unable to speak. A few days later, while cleaning the cabin, she found the sketchbook. It was tucked away in the wooden chest where he kept the child's shirt. She knew she should not look, that it was a violation of his privacy, but she could not help herself. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with charcoal drawings, rendered with a surprising, self-taught skill. There were sketches of the landscape, of animals, of traps. Then she found the portraits. There were dozens of a woman with dark, braided hair and high cheekbones, Nailin. In some, she was smiling, her eyes full of life. In others, she was pensive, her gaze distant. Caleb had captured her soul on the page. There were drawings of a tiny infant, swaddled in blankets, its small face serene in sleep. Eleanor's heart ached looking at them, at this lost family, this world of love that had been destroyed. She turned a page, and her breath caught in her throat. It was her. He had drawn her sitting by the fire, her head bent as she stitched his trousers. He had drawn her in profile, looking out the window at the falling snow, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. And there was one of her on Buck's back, her face turned toward the sun, that brilliant, joyful smile she remembered lighting up her features. He had not drawn a victim. He had drawn a survivor. He had seen a strength in her that she was only just beginning to find in herself. That evening, she could not pretend she had not seen it. She waited until the fire had burned low. Then she walked over to him, the open sketchbook in her hands. "I found this," she said quietly, holding it out. He looked at the book, then at her, his face unreadable. She turned to the drawing of Nalin, then to the drawing of herself. Her heart was a painful knot of confusion. She felt a pang of jealousy for the woman he had so clearly adored, and an overwhelming gratitude for the way he saw her. "You loved her," she whispered, her voice torn. I am not her." Caleb looked at the drawings of his wife, and a shadow of his old grief passed over his face. Then he looked at Eleanor, standing before him in the firelight, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. He reached out and gently took the sketchbook from her, closing it. "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You're not, and I do not want you to be." He held her gaze, his eyes full of a startling, raw honesty. "But I want you here." The words were a release. He was not trying to replace his past. He was choosing a future. He was choosing her. A storm broke that night, a violent spring squall with rumbling thunder and brilliant flashes of lightning that illuminated the dark cabin. The rain came down in a torrent, drumming on the roof in a wild, frantic rhythm. The storm outside was a reflection of the one that had been building inside the small cabin for weeks. In the darkness, broken by the fleeting, stark light of the heavens, they found each other. There were no words. There was only a desperate, quiet reaching. His scarred hands were gentle in her hair, on her face, tracing the lines of her body as if memorizing a map of a new world. Her hands explored the hard, muscled planes of his back, the old scars that told their own stories of survival. They made love in the shadows, their movements desperate and quiet, as if they were afraid the world might hear and come to snatch this fragile, stolen moment away from them. It was not the gentle, practiced love of stories. It was a raw, elemental collision of two people who had been starved of touch, of tenderness, of human connection. It was an act of profound and silent communion, a desperate claiming of life in the face of all the death and loss they had endured. As the storm raged outside, they held each other in the quiet center of the tempest, two outcasts finding a fleeting, sacred home in each other's arms. The spring came on the back of a warm Chinook wind that devoured the snow in a matter of days. The valley flooded, the creek transforming into a brown, raging river that tore at the land, rearranging the landscape as if by a great and angry hand. The world turned to mud, and then, almost overnight, to a tender, vibrant green. Life returned with a fierce, desperate urgency. With the passable roads came people. A lone trapper, making his way down from the high country, stopped at Caleb's cabin to trade a few beaver pelts for coffee and salt. He was a grizzled, talkative man named Elias, hungry for human company after a long and solitary winter. He shared news from the towns and settlements, and it was from him that the blow fell. "Funny thing in Harper's Hollow," he said, sipping the hot, black coffee Eleanor had poured for him. "The preacher, a stern old goat named Whitley, has put out a notice, offering a reward for any information leading to the safe return of his daughter. Seems she ran off right after her wedding to that rancher fellow, or so the story goes. Elias winked, a gesture of shared worldly wisdom. $100. Folks are saying she must have shamed the family something fierce for them to want her back that bad. Eleanor's hand, holding the coffee pot, trembled so violently that a few hot drops spilled onto her skin. She barely felt the sting. $100. It was a fortune. It was enough to make men ride, enough to make them ask questions, enough to turn every stranger into a potential threat. Her father was not seeking her return. He was posting a bounty. He was hunting her, after Elias had gone. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the cabin. Caleb watched her, his face a grim mask. The fragile peace they had built seemed to shatter, the outside world rushing in to reclaim them. "We have to leave," he said finally, his voice low and certain. "We can head west, over the mountains. I know the passes. We can find new land, a place where no one knows our names. We can be gone before anyone thinks to look this far out." His words painted a picture of escape, of a clean slate. A few weeks ago, she would have clung to that offer as a drowning woman clings to a log. But something had changed in her. The woman who had learned to fire a rifle, who had been seen and valued by this man, was not the same one who had crawled, broken, to his door. She turned from the window, her jaw set with a resolve that surprised even herself. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I will not run forever. Caleb, I have been running my whole life, running from my father's judgment, from my husband's cruelty, from my own shame." She crossed the small space between them and stood before him, looking directly into his stormy gray eyes. "Running means they win. It means I will spend the rest of my days looking over my shoulder, afraid of every shadow. I will not live like that." "Eleanor, you don't know these men," he argued, a desperate edge to his voice. "They will not be reasoned with. They will tear you apart." "I am already torn apart," she replied, her voice softening. "You are the one who has been putting the pieces back together. Don't you see? I cannot finish the job if I am still a fugitive from a life I did not choose." She took a deep, steadying breath. "I want to face them, beside you." The last two words were the heart of it. It was not a solitary act of defiance. It was an act of faith in him, in them. He looked at her, at the fierce, determined light in her eyes, and he saw that she was no longer the fragile creature he had rescued. She was a woman choosing her own ground upon which to fight. And he knew, with a sinking feeling of dread and a surge of profound admiration, that he would not, could not, deny her this. 2 days later, they rode into Harper's Hollow. They rode side by side, Buck stepping with his usual steady gait, and a pack mule Caleb had bought from Elias trailing behind. Eleanor wore her dress made from his blanket. Her hair was neatly braided, and she sat tall in the saddle he had fashioned for her. Caleb was clean-shaven, his pistol holstered on his hip, his rifle resting in a scabbard beside his leg. They did not look like fugitives. They looked like settlers, a man and a woman with a purpose, but the town saw them for what they were, a scandal. As they moved down the muddy main street, a hush fell over the town. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. The boisterous laughter from the saloon died away. Faces appeared in windows. Curtains were parted. The people of Harper's Hollow stopped and stared. Some faces held shock, others a cold, undisguised disgust. This was the preacher's daughter, the one who had vanished in shame, and she had returned on the arm of Redmond's dog, the town pariah. It was a brazen, public defiance of everything their rigid, ordered world stood for. Outside the saloon, a group of men loitered on the boardwalk. Among them was Silas Whitley. He was heavier than Eleanor remembered, his face puffy and flushed with drink. When he saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into slits of pure, venomous hatred. A sneer twisted his lips as his gaze moved from her to Caleb, a look of contemptuous ownership, as if Caleb had stolen a piece of his property. He said nothing, but his sneer was a promise of violence to come. Eleanor met his gaze, her heart pounding. and refused to look away until Caleb had guided their horses past. They took a room at the town's only inn, a place of dubious cleanliness run by a sour-faced woman who took their money without meeting their eyes, leaving their gear. Caleb insisted on accompanying her to the one place she knew she had to go. The church stood at the end of the street, its white steeple stark against the blue sky. It had been her entire world, a place of sanctuary and of suffocating rules. The smell inside was the same: old paper, beeswax, and a faint, cloying scent of decaying piety. Her father was in his study, a small, dark room lined with books. He looked up when she entered, his face a mask of stern, unforgiving lines, paling in shock. He rose slowly, his eyes darting past her to where Caleb stood, a silent, imposing guardian in the doorway. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice a mixture of horror and outrage. "What is the meaning of this? To return like this? With him?" "I came to tell you to take down your notice." "Father," she said, her voice steady, "I am not lost, and I am not returning." He moved around the desk, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He ignored Caleb, focusing the full force of his will upon her. He came close and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound she had learned to dread. "You have shamed the Lord," he hissed. "You have shamed my name, my ministry. You have consorted with a man of violence, an outcast. But the Lord is merciful, and I am his vessel. Repent, child. Cast this sinner aside. Come back to the fold, and I will wash you clean. We will tell the town you were lost, that you were ill in the mind. It can be undone." His hand reached for her, a gesture not of comfort, but of ownership. He meant to take her arm, to lead her, to force her back into the role she had been born to play. Something inside Eleanor snapped. All the years of fear, of forced obedience, of swallowing her own voice, coalesced into a single, sharp act of rebellion. She slapped his hand away, the sound cracking like a whip in the silent study. His eyes widened in stunned disbelief. "The Lord watched you cast me out," she said, her voice low and trembling with a righteous fury she did not know she possessed. "He watched Silas beat me, and he watched you lock your heart against your own daughter. Do not speak to me of being washed clean. You are the one who is filthy." She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the study without looking back. She did not see the look of pure, unadulterated rage that twisted her father's face. She only saw Caleb, his eyes filled with a quiet, fierce pride that was worth more to her than a lifetime of her father's conditional love. They stepped back out into the harsh sunlight of the street, and Silas was there, waiting for them. He had moved from the saloon and was now standing directly in their path, his face a mottled red, his fists clenched at his sides. "Whitley," Caleb said, his voice a low warning. "Step aside. You think you can just ride into my town with my wife and walk away?" Silas spat, his eyes wild. He was drunk, but it was more than that. It was the fury of a humiliated man, a man whose authority had been publicly challenged. "She is not your wife," Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm. "Not anymore. She is my property until the day she dies," Silas roared, and he lunged. It was not a graceful fight. It was a brutal, scrapping, unrefined brawl in the mud of the main street. Silas was bigger, heavier, and fueled by a drunken rage. He threw wild, powerful punches, one of which caught Caleb high on the cheekbone, a sickening crunch that sent a spray of blood from his lip. But Caleb was faster, harder. He moved with a lethal economy, absorbing the blows, his face a mask of cold concentration. He was not fighting with rage, he was fighting with a purpose. He ducked under a wild swing and drove his fist into Silas's soft middle. The air rushed out of the rancher in a great whoosh. Caleb followed it with a hard right to the jaw that sent Silas staggering backward. Silas fell, landing hard in the muddy street. He lay there for a moment, stunned, blood trickling from his own mouth. Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. For a terrifying second, Eleanor thought he would kill him. The whole town was watching, silent spectators to the brutal drama, but Caleb did not kill him. He knelt, grabbing a handful of Silas's shirt, and pulled the dazed man's face close to his. He did not shout. He whispered. His words meant only for Silas, a venomous, private verdict. "She was never yours to break." He let go, and Silas's head lolled back into the mud. Caleb stood, turned his back on his defeated foe, and walked over to Eleanor. He took her arm gently and led her away, leaving Silas Whitley to be helped up by his cronies, his public humiliation complete, back in the small, dusty room at the inn. The adrenaline faded, leaving them both trembling. Eleanor tended to Caleb's wounds with a basin of water and a clean cloth. His lip was split, and a nasty bruise was already forming on his cheek, but his eyes were clear. She gently dabbed the cloth at the cut on his lip, her touch infinitely tender. "I was never brave," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Not once in my whole life, not until I stood beside you." He caught her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers, and held it against his chest. "You were always brave, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough. "You just needed a reason to show it." That night, they knew they could not stay. The town was a hornet's nest they had kicked. They planned to leave before dawn, but their enemies did not wait that long. Eleanor was woken by the smell of smoke, not the familiar, comforting smell of a wood fire, but the acrid, choking scent of something burning that should not be. She sat up, her heart instantly pounding. A flickering orange light was dancing under the door of their room. "Caleb!" she cried, shaking him awake. He was alert in an instant. He swung his legs out of the bed, grabbing his pistol from the nightstand. The crackle of flames was audible now, coming from the hallway, along with the sound of shouting from downstairs. Caleb crept to the door and laid his hand flat against it. He swore under his breath, snatching it back. "It's hot. They've set a fire in the hall. They mean to trap us in here." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Eleanor. They were on the second floor. The window looked down onto a narrow, dark alleyway. It was their only way out. Caleb moved with a swift, desperate purpose. He threw open the window, the cool night air rushing in, feeding the smoke that was now pouring under the door. He tossed their saddlebags out into the alley, followed by his rifle. He ripped a blanket from the bed and tied it to the leg of the heavy iron bedstead. "Go," he said, his voice urgent as he threw the makeshift rope out the window. "I'll be right behind you." The fire was roaring now, the wood of the door beginning to char. Eleanor did not hesitate. She swung her legs over the sill, her hands gripping the rough wool of the blanket. The drop was terrifying. For a moment, she dangled, her worn boots scraping against the wooden siding of the inn. Then her feet found the ground. She looked up just as a sheet of flame burst through the door of their room. Caleb was framed for a horrifying second against the inferno. He climbed out the window, his movements fluid and fast. He slid down the blanket, landing with a soft thud beside her, just as the window above them exploded in a shower of glass and fire. They did not wait to see more. They ran, grabbing their gear, and fled through the back alleys of the town toward the livery stable. Behind them, the inn was being consumed by the flames, a roaring funeral pyre lighting up the night sky. Shouts and the clang of the fire bell filled the air. They saddled their horses in a frantic haste, their movements lit by the terrible orange glow. They rode out of Harper's Hollow not as they had entered, but as fugitives, the smell of smoke in their hair and the taste of ash in their mouths. They spurred the horses into a gallop, leaving the town and its judgment behind them. Eleanor clung to the saddle horn, her gaze fixed on Caleb's back as he led the way into the darkness, the stars above and the smoke behind them like a final, fiery farewell to the past. They rode hard through the night, pushing the horses until their sides were heaving and lathered with sweat. The moon was a sliver, offering little light to guide them through the treacherous, broken country. They were not on a road or a trail, but moving cross-country, with Caleb navigating by the stars and the feel of the land. A knowledge so deep, it seemed instinctual. The fire of Harper's Hollow faded behind them, but its memory was a brand on Eleanor's mind. They pushed on for 2 days, stopping only for brief, exhausted rests to water the horses and chew on hardtack. The gentle, rolling hills gave way to a harsher landscape of sharp-edged canyons and steep, rocky inclines. It was a land that did not suffer fools or the unprepared. On the third day, they were forced across a narrow, crumbling ledge that hugged the side of a deep gorge. A misstep would mean a fall of 100 feet onto the jagged rocks below. Caleb dismounted, his face grim. "We'll walk them across one at a time," he said, his voice tight. "Stay close to the wall. Do not look down." He led Buck across first, the horse's iron-shod hooves striking sparks on the rock, its ears twitching nervously at the drop. They made it safely to the other side. Caleb secured Buck and started back for her. Eleanor, leading her own horse and the pack mule, began to follow. She did as he said, keeping her eyes fixed on the rock wall beside her. The path was barely a foot wide in places. The wind howled up from the gorge, a hungry, hollow sound that seemed to pull at her, trying to suck her into the void. Her horse, less steady than Buck, shied as a loose rock skittered over the edge. The movement was sudden. Yanking the reins in her hand, it threw her off balance. Her worn boot slipped on a patch of loose shale. For a horrifying, weightless moment, she was falling. She cried out, her hands flying out to scrabble for a hold. Her body slammed against the rock face, and her right leg twisted beneath her, a searing, white-hot pain shooting from her calf to her hip. She managed to stop her fall, her fingers digging into the crevices of the rock, her cheek pressed against the cold, rough stone. But the damage was done. Caleb was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of terror. He got the horses the rest of the way across, his movements brutal in their efficiency. And then he came back for her. He examined her leg with gentle, probing fingers. A long, deep gash ran the length of her calf, cut by the sharp edge of a rock. It was bleeding freely, the dark red blood a shocking stain against her pale skin and the gray stone. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice strained. She tried, but the moment she put weight on the leg, a wave of blackness and nausea washed over her. She would have collapsed if he had not been holding her. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms. He was not gentle. He was desperate, his arms clamping around her like iron bands. He carried her across the remaining stretch of the ledge, his own boots sure-footed, his gaze fixed and furious. And then he began to walk. He carried her for what felt like an eternity. The sun beat down, and the world became a dizzying, painful blur. Every jarring step he took sent a fresh wave of agony through her leg. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear and the desperate tension in his body. She looked up at his face. It was a landscape of its own, torn not by pain, but by a terrible, helpless rage. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, burning with a fury directed at the rocks, at the sky, at his own inability to have prevented this. He was a man trapped in a nightmare he had lived before, and the fury was his only weapon against the encroaching darkness of his fear. By the time dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Eleanor was drifting in and out of consciousness, her body burning with fever. Caleb finally found what he was looking for, a shallow cave, little more than a dark slash in the side of a rock formation, sheltered from the wind by a stand of gnarled junipers. He laid her down inside, his movements now almost unnaturally gentle, as if he were afraid she might break. He started a small, smokeless fire with the skill of long practice, its flickering light pushing back the deep shadows of the cave. He used his canteen to clean the wound as best he could, his touch surprisingly deft. The gash was deep, ugly, and still weeping blood. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was pale as death in the firelight, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. And in the flickering gloom of that primitive shelter, Caleb Rowe finally broke. It began not with a sound, but with a shudder that ran through his entire body. He lowered his head into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. A sound was torn from his throat, a ragged, wrenching sob that seemed to come from the deepest, most wounded part of his soul. He had not wept when they called him names, nor when he had fought for his life. But here, faced with the fragile, flickering life of this woman, the iron walls he had built around his heart crumbled to dust. Tears streamed through his calloused fingers. He knelt beside her, his face a mask of utter desolation. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking away a strand of sweat-dampened hair. "Do not leave me, Eleanor," he begged, his voice a raw, broken whisper. The sound of her name on his lips was an intimacy more profound than any kiss. "Please, I cannot bury another woman I love." The words, a confession of his deepest, most terrified secret, hung in the silent cave. He was not just seeing her, lying pale and wounded. He was seeing Nalin, his morning star, her life ebbing away in their small cabin. He was seeing the ghost of a loss so profound it had hollowed him out. And now that same specter had returned to claim him again. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. Through a haze of pain and fever, she saw him, this strong, silent man, undone by his fear for her. His grief was a raw, living thing, and in that moment, her own pain seemed to recede, replaced by an overwhelming need to comfort him. She raised a weak, trembling hand and laid it against his tear-streaked cheek. Her voice was a faint, breathless whisper, but it was clear and steady in the small, quiet space. "Then do not," she said, "live with me, Caleb, even if it is just one more day. Live with me." It was not a plea. It was a command, an act of sheer, defiant will. She was refusing to be another ghost in his past. She was demanding a future, no matter how brief. Her words seemed to reach him, to pull him back from the edge of his despair. He took a long, shuddering breath, mastering himself. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate love that stole her breath away. He knew what he had to do. He took a needle and a length of thread from his saddlebag. He held them in the fire for a moment to cleanse them. When he turned back to her, his hands were trembling, the same hands that could field dress a deer with surgical precision, that could aim a rifle with deadly calm, now shook with the fear of causing her more pain. He began to stitch the wound, his movements clumsy at first, then surer as he focused on the task. Each pull of the needle sent a jolt of fire up Eleanor's leg, but she did not cry out. She bit her lip until she tasted blood and watched his face, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he worked, and as she felt herself begin to drift away on a tide of pain and fever, she reached up and ran her hand through his thick, dark hair. It was a simple, instinctual gesture of comfort, an anchor for them both in a world that had been reduced to firelight, shadow, and pain. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. She awoke to the sound of a voice she did not recognize, speaking in a low, guttural language. She opened her eyes. A man was kneeling beside her, his face weathered and creased as old leather. He had the high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes of the Apache people. He was examining her leg with a practiced, gentle touch. Caleb was there, too, speaking to the man in that same quiet language. "He is Tomas," Caleb said to her, his voice soft with relief. "An old friend. He found our tracks." Thomas looked at her and gave a slow, grave nod. He spoke to Caleb again, and Caleb translated. "He says the wound is clean, but the fever is deep. He is taking us to a healer, a woman in his village. It is a day's ride from here." Thomas and Caleb fashioned a travois, 2 long poles hitched to the back of the mule, with a blanket stretched between them. They laid her on it as gently as they could. The journey was a blur of hazy images and sensations, the gentle, swaying motion, the warmth of the sun on her face, the low murmur of the 2 men's voices. The days that followed were quiet, dreamlike. The Apache village was a small, sheltered encampment in a hidden valley. The healer was an old woman with eyes that seemed to see right through to the bone. She treated Eleanor's leg with poultices of crushed herbs that smelled of damp earth and pine, and gave her bitter teas that broke the fever and let her sleep a deep, dreamless sleep. Caleb never left her side. He sat on a blanket outside the healer's dwelling, cleaning his weapons, mending his gear, or simply watching her sleep. In the quiet days of her recovery, as her strength slowly returned, he began to speak of the West, not the hard, unforgiving country they had just crossed, but the land beyond the great mountains, the territories of Oregon and Washington. He spoke of valleys so green and fertile that a man could build a life with nothing but his own 2 hands. He talked of vast forests of giant trees, of rivers so full of salmon you could almost walk across their backs. He described a new land, a place where the past was a distant memory, where a man's name was the one he made for himself, not the one that had been cursed by others. It was not just a description of a place, it was the articulation of a dream, a hope. For a life beyond running, beyond fighting, a life of peace. They began to plan, their voices low and hopeful in the quiet evenings. They would not be fugitives. They would be pioneers. They would be a family, a unit of 2, choosing each other beyond the laws of the church, the judgment of towns, or the names they had been born with. One evening, as a full moon rose over the valley, casting the world in a soft, silver light, Eleanor felt strong enough to walk a few steps, leaning on Caleb for support. They stood together, looking out at the peaceful village, the smoke from the small fires curling up into the clear, starry sky. She turned to him, her hand resting on his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart. She looked up into his face, at the man who had faced down her husband, who had promised to stand between her and the world, who had wept for fear of losing her. She rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss full of a quiet, profound gratitude. "You did not just take me in, Caleb," she whispered against his lips. "You made me someone worth taking in." He held her close, his arms wrapping around her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. For a long, perfect moment, they stood in the moonlight, their shared future stretching before them, a clean, unwritten page. The peace was shattered the next morning. Tomas returned from a scouting trip, his face grim. He brought news, gathered from a traveler on the main trail. The news had spread from Harper's Hollow. Silas Whitley, his name and pride ruined, had sworn vengeance. He had used the preacher's reward money, and some of his own, to hire a posse of hard men. They were not coming to bring her back. They were coming to kill them both. The dream of Oregon died in the grim light of the morning sun. There was no more talk of green valleys or a life of peace. The news that Tomas brought was a declaration of war, and the idyllic Apache village, once a sanctuary, was now a liability. To stay would be to bring Silas Whitley's violence down upon the people who had shown them kindness, a price neither Caleb nor Eleanor was willing to pay. Their preparations were grim and methodical. The time for running was over. Now was the time for choosing their ground. Tomas, his face a mask of stone, led them back into the harsh, broken country they had fled. But this time they were not seeking escape. They were seeking a fortress. He took them to a place the Apache called the Eagle's Jaw, a narrow, defensible ridge flanked by a sheer cliff on one side and a steep, rock-strewn slope that fell away to a fast-moving river on the other. It was a natural choke point. Anyone wishing to reach them would have to come up the narrow, exposed trail from the north. There was a small, shallow cave set back from the ridge, large enough for shelter, and a clear spring that trickled from the rocks, providing fresh water. For 2 days, they worked without rest, turning the place into a defensible position. Caleb, drawing on a knowledge of tactics that spoke of a past far more violent than that of a simple cowboy, directed their efforts. He and Tomas rolled heavy boulders to the edge of the slope, creating a crude but effective barricade that narrowed the approach to a few feet. They cleared brush to create clean fields of fire and identified the best positions for cover. Eleanor worked alongside them, her own transformation now complete. The woman who had once fainted at the sight of her own blood now hauled rocks until her hands were raw, her movements driven by a cold, fierce determination. She cleaned and loaded the rifles, stacking the cartridges in neat, accessible piles. Her face was pale and set, the fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a soldier preparing for a siege. She was fighting not just for her own life, but for the life of the man who had given her a reason to live, for the fragile, precious future they had dared to imagine together. On the third morning, Thomas, who had been scouting the lowlands, returned. "They come," he said, his voice a low whisper that carried more weight than a shout. 10 men. They will be here by midday." A tense, heavy silence settled over the ridge. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the rocks. The only sounds were the rush of the river below and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Caleb checked his pistol for the 10th time. Eleanor took her position behind a low wall of rocks, a rifle resting on the stone before her. Its weight felt solid, real, an extension of her own will. Caleb came to her, kneeling beside her. He took her hand, his calloused palm rough against her own. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and urgent, "when they come, you stay here, you keep your head down. No matter what happens, do you understand?" She looked at him, at the deep, desperate fear for her safety that was etched around his eyes. She squeezed his hand. "I understand," she said. But in her heart, she made a different vow. She would not hide. She would not cower. She would stand with him. They did not have to wait long. They appeared first as a slow-moving cloud of dust in the distance, then as a line of dark figures on horseback, picking their way up the winding trail. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. 10 men. At the head of the posse rode Silas Whitley, his bulk unmistakable even from a distance. Beside him rode the bounty hunter with the scarred lip, Cutler, the man who had recognized her in the pines. The posse halted at the bottom of the slope, just out of effective rifle range. They were a rough collection of hired guns and town roughnecks, their faces hard and greedy in the midday sun. Silas Whitley's voice, amplified by his rage, carried up to them on the wind. "Row! You have something that belongs to me. Send out my wife, and I might let you live." Caleb stepped out from behind the rocks, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He stood in the open, a clear target, his presence a defiant challenge. "She is not your wife, Whitley, and she is not your property. Turn around and ride away. This is your only warning." Cutler, the bounty hunter, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "There's 10 of us. Row, and only one of you. There are 2 of us," Eleanor's voice called out, clear and steady, startling the men below, and even Caleb. She rose from behind her rock, the rifle held firmly in her hands, its stock braced against her shoulder. The sight of her, standing there not as a cowering victim but as a combatant, seemed to stun the posse into a momentary silence. Silas's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "The harlot has a gun," he spat. "So be it. $100 to the man who brings him down." The world exploded in a chaos of noise and violence. The crack of a dozen rifles echoed off the canyon walls. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off the rocks with angry, metallic screams. Eleanor and Caleb ducked back into cover, the air around them thick with the smell of gunpowder. Thomas, hidden in a crevice higher up the cliff, fired a single, carefully aimed shot, and one of the men in the posse cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell from his horse. The fight descended into a brutal, tense standoff. The posse used their horses for cover, advancing slowly up the slope, firing as they came. Caleb, Eleanor, and Thomas returned fire, their shots measured, aimed to slow the advance, to make the price of every foot of ground a costly one. Eleanor was no longer afraid. The terror had been burned away, replaced by a cold, focused clarity. She was aware of everything, the heat of the sun on her back, the sharp recoil of the rifle against her shoulder, the ping of bullets striking the rocks in front of her. She sighted. She fired. She reloaded, her movements becoming a fluid, mechanical rhythm. She was not aiming to kill. She was aiming to protect the man who fought beside her. But Silas's men were relentless, driven by the promise of money and the safety of their numbers. They gained the top of the slope, spreading out, using the rocks for cover. The fighting became close, desperate. Eleanor saw him then. Cutler. He had worked his way around to the side, and he had a clear shot. Not at Caleb, but at her. She saw the glint of the sun on his rifle barrel. Saw him take aim. Time seemed to slow down. She tried to move, to duck, but her body felt frozen, leaden. She saw Caleb see it too. His head whipped around, his eyes widening in a moment of pure, undiluted terror. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He moved. He threw himself in front of her, his body covering hers just as Cutler's rifle cracked. The sound was flat, final. Caleb grunted, a sharp, guttural sound of impact, and his body went rigid against hers. He staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and then he collapsed, his dead weight falling across her, knocking her to the ground. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the back of his shirt, just below his shoulder blade. "Caleb!" The scream was torn from her throat, a sound of primal agony. For a moment, the world went silent. All she could hear was the blood roaring in her ears. Then, a terrible, cold rage, a fury unlike anything she had ever known, washed over her. They had shot him. They had shot the only good thing in her world, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She pushed his heavy body off of her and scrambled for the rifle. She looked over the rocks. Cutler was reloading, a triumphant smirk on his scarred face. She raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The weapon kicked hard against her shoulder. The smirk on Cutler's face vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief as a red flower bloomed on his chest. He fell backward and did not move again. The other men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, a new sound joined the fray. A series of high, piercing war cries from the river below. Thomas had not been alone. A handful of Apache warriors, his friends, his allies, had come. They rose from the rocks and the brush, firing arrows and rifles. A sudden, terrifying force that turned the tide of the battle in an instant. The posse, caught between Eleanor's rifle from above and the surprise attack from below, broke. They scrambled back down the slope, dragging their wounded, their greed forgotten in a panicked, desperate rout. Eleanor did not watch them go. She crawled to Caleb. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. The back of his shirt was soaked with blood. She ripped the cloth away. The wound was high in his back, a small, dark hole from which his life was steadily draining. She grabbed him under the arms and began to drag him. He was a dead weight, impossibly heavy, but she did not stop. She dragged him across the rocky ground, back into the relative safety of the small cave, her own wounded legs screaming in protest. She laid him down as gently as she could and tore strips from her own dress to pack the wound, to try and staunch the bleeding, her hands covered in his blood. He was dying. She could see it in the waxy pallor of his skin, could feel it in the chilling cold of his hands. Thomas and the others came, their faces grim. They did what they could, but the wound was deep, the damage internal. There was no healer here, only the harsh judgment of the wilderness. That night, she refused to leave his side. She sat in the small cave, lit by a single candle, and held his hand. He drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, muttering words she could not understand. She bathed his face with cool water. She whispered his name. She begged him to stay in the deepest, quietest hour of the night. His eyes opened. They were clear, for a moment, and they focused on her. He tried to speak, but it came out as a weak, rattling cough. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto their joined hands. She leaned close, her lips almost touching his ear, her voice a fierce, desperate vow in the darkness. "If you die, Caleb, I die," she whispered. "Do you hear me? I will not live in a world without you, but if you live, if you fight and you live, I will be your wife, in the eyes of God. I will be your wife. I do not care what they call me. I am yours." He squeezed her hand, a flicker of his old strength, and his lips formed a single, soundless word. Her name, Eleanor. Then his eyes closed, and he slipped back into the darkness. He survived. It was a long, slow battle, waged in the quiet of the Apache village, where they had carried him. For weeks, he hovered between life and death, his strength so depleted he was like a child. Eleanor never left him. She fed him broth one spoonful at a time. She cleaned his wounds. She held his hand through the long, fevered nights, her vow a constant, silent prayer. And slowly, inch by agonizing inch, he fought his way back. The bullet had missed his heart, and his own stubborn, resilient will, tethered to the world by her promise, refused to let go. Months later, stories began to trickle into the settlements west of the border. Far from Harper's Hollow, travelers spoke of a man and a woman rebuilding an old, abandoned homestead in a forgotten valley. The man was tall and quiet, with a scar high on his back and eyes that had seen too much. The woman was beautiful, with a slight limp and a strength that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fire. The locals whispered stories about them, tales that grew with each telling. They spoke of the preacher's daughter who had been cast out, and of the reclusive outlaw who had taken her in. They spoke of a fire, a gunfight, and of a woman who had stood with a rifle on a rocky ridge, holding off a dozen men for the sake of love. One night, the first snow of a new winter had begun to fall. Dusting the half-finished roof of their small, sturdy cabin, they sat by a fire under the vast, open sky, the stars like chips of ice in the blackness. The world was quiet, peaceful. Eleanor leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, the one that was now healed, and watched the flames dance. "Kicked from my own house," she whispered, the words a distant echo of an old pain. "But I found home in you." Caleb turned and kissed her forehead, his rough, scarred hands cradling her face as if she were made of the most delicate glass. A small, real smile, a thing she had seen so rarely, touched his lips. "And you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he would never be able to fully express. "You gave me back my name." The wind howled in the distance, a lonely sound from the vast, empty wilderness. But in their arms, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and a love that had been forged in violence and loss, it was quiet. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.